Film Society of Lincoln Center. Documentary is a vital part of the art of cinema, and over the last few years we've really grown our spotlight on documentary. So to me it's a wonderful reflection to see these fantastic filmmakers, all of whom are presenting films that are different in content and style and length and everything else. So it's really terrific to have them here. If you don't mind, I'm just going to take a moment to ask them each to just say a few moments, just a few words about their film and how they kind of came to the film and how they, what was the impetus for the start of it, and then we'll sort of dig in a little bit, and then we'll take some questions from you. What if I start here, Mark?
Sure. First of all, thank you very much. As a rookie filmmaker, this is my first feature film that I've ever done. I used to be in the TV shopping business. I used to run the Home Shopping Network. Really? And Bill Cunningham died 2.5 years ago in June. And I had done an interview with him 25 years ago. And on that day, I watched the other documentary that was done about him about 7 years ago for the first time, and I went in my basement, I retrieved this interview and bumped it up. It was on Betacam, and I bumped it up to a digital file, and I watched it, and I certainly didn't want to do a redux of the other movie that did really well, and I watched this movie, and he had called me up to interview him for 10 minutes for an award he was receiving in 1994, and 10 minutes turned into 4 hours, and he told me his whole story. In really great, passionate, emotional, funny storytelling and teaching kinds of ways. And so I started developing it that day as a film, and 2.5 years later, you know, it's premiering at Alice Tully on Thursday night, and I'm wildly grateful. I got access to his archive of 3 million photographs and documents that will go down as one of the most important documentations of New York City in the history of New York City. A man who took pictures for 50 years every single day. And to have that after having a narrative in my film for a year without having any of his pictures because I couldn't get access. And he's telling these stories, but I had nothing to back them up, but now I have plenty to back them up. So again, thank you for having me here. I'm extremely excited that the film's going to be playing at Alice Tully on Thursday.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing it. Wow, that's a dream. It is, though. I'm Alexis Bloom. I'm the director of Divide and Conquer, the story of Roger Ailes. It's an investigative documentary into the life of a very sort of important and influential person whose world we now live in. I sort of think about it like an origin story, really, as a way to understand where we are politically and culturally using the arc of this one man's life. I started in a kind of different way. We were looking at Rupert Murdoch and kind of trying to understand our world through that world and through Fox and through media, and sort of drifted towards Roger Ailes. And yes, one does, because he is colourful, and I did it with a very sort of supportive, great, experienced filmmaker called Alex Gibney, who's my executive producer. And when I said, you know, shit, we're going to get sued for this, he was like, go for it. So that's that.
Right.
Hi, I'm Manny Kirchheimer. And Dream of a City really originated 1958 to 1960, when my friend Walter Hess and I used to go when we weren't working and shoot a very scripted film that was going to be 2 hours long and was going to be called Dream of a City. At the time, we found it difficult to edit it together, and finally we gave up. And I suggested to him that we dig into the material as a grab bag, each of us, but he never did. And I made a film called Claw in 1968, and then a film called Bridge High, and then I used some of the material in other films that I made. However, there was still 30 hours or so of film left. And so recently, since I like to alternate in my filmmaking between films with sound on the spot or talking head films and montage films, because this film has no dialogue, I took this material, which was silent at the time, shot with a Bolex, and decided to make a movie out of it. And I only got 39 minutes. It turned out not to be a feature, although I'm now pulling other material from the film to make yet another film from it. And I hope it works out. I have no idea what it's going to look like.
Well, if it looks anything like Dream of a City, we're in for a treat. Really beautiful. James?
Yeah, this gives me hope for the future, actually. I'm going to hang on to all my material for future work. I'm James, and I made a film called Angels Are Made of Light in Afghanistan. It's about a school in this sort of working class neighborhood, and I follow the teachers and the students for 3 years. And they narrate their own stories. There's no English in the film. The woman who cleans the school narrates the Civil War. I went into the archive, in the National Archive in Kabul, and I found all this 35 millimeter material of the history of Afghanistan, and so I have all this, I have a kind of a parallel, there's sort of two parallel timelines in the film. The timeline, the historical timeline that starts with the king and then goes through the communist revolution and into the Civil War, that comes in and out of the film, and then there's the sort of the modern life in Kabul. And so the idea of the film is really, through the lens of this kind of microcosm of the school, you get to see ordinary daily life in Afghanistan in a way that we ordinarily don't see it, because our view of Afghanistan is usually it comes through our media, which is very much focused on if it bleeds, it leads. It's all about the fighting.
Roger Ailes, in other words.
Embedding, right, exactly. And I wanted to make something that was really different from that, and that would be really about not a war film, but a peace film, if you like. Yeah, that's all from me.
Hi, I'm Tom Surgal. I made a movie entitled Fire Music. It's about the nascent avant-garde jazz scene. And I don't really know why I made it, but I just wanted to maybe generate focus on what I consider to be one of the most important and perhaps unheard and uncinematically explored themes that deserve some more focus. So that sounds good. We'll leave it at that.
Well, let me take a step from that, Tom. As a filmmaker, is that part of what you want to explore, worlds that are unseen? What motivates you to get out there as a documentary filmmaker?
Yeah, well, this project's been a long time in the making, so it took about 11 years. I don't know. I don't even know if I approached it in that way. This music has been such a vital part of my life since I was 13, and I've been talking about this a lot in the course of these Q&As, but about 18 years back, Ken Burns did a documentary entitled Jazz, and it was a pretty exhaustive study, 20 hours long, pretty much delved into every aspect of the idiom, and he devoted about 2 minutes to the avant-garde, and my contemporaries and I were somewhat aghast at that, so I only half-jokingly referred to my project in the making as the parts that were left out of the Ken Burns documentary. That's the sanitized version.
going to say, how does Ken Burns feel about that?
Well, I told this story the other night, but one of the main talking heads in my movie is the noted jazz and film critic Gary Giddens. And Gary was very much featured in the Ken Burns documentary, and a friend of mine happened to be working on a shoot with him, and he started conversing with Gary, and he said, you know, Gary, there wasn't very much about avant-garde jazz in that movie. And I always thought Gary was aligned with the aesthetic that movie had put forth, and Gary's response was, "Fuck Ken Burns," all right? So that was going to be our alternate title for my movie.
No one here is going to tweet that, right? I'm sure it's all entre nous. James, your film, it really does take a different perspective, the way that we've looked at Afghanistan and the stories that have been told from there. How were you able to get that access? What was your motivation in trying to tell that story, and how long was your process? Because I know it was a number of years as well.
Right. Well, I didn't start out in Afghanistan. I had the idea to make the film while I was filming in Iraq back in 2005. And I thought, you know, I'm going to make a film in like a village school, like centered in a village school in Iran, up in the mountains in northern Iran. And I worked for a long time between 2007 and 2009 to make this film in Iran. And eventually I was kicked out along with all the other foreign journalists because of the Green Uprising in 2009. And so I just couldn't complete the project there. So I decided to move it to Pakistan, this idea of like the school-based film. And in Pakistan, I was filming in the biggest orphanage in the country. It was this huge world in itself, like thousands of kids, and they had their own bakeries, their own laundries, and everything. And it was this fascinating place. But again, there were these political scandals that happened, the assassination of Osama bin Laden, and before that there were some other things that happened that made the problems between the United States government and the Pakistani government. And so, again, I was kicked out along with a lot of other American passport holders. And so I moved my project in 2011. I moved it to Afghanistan, and from 2011 until 2015, I filmed there. And so it did take a long time to get, you know, and even in Afghanistan, it wasn't as though I went directly to the school that I filmed. I filmed in 8 different schools and also another big orphanage, 2 different hospitals. I looked at a lot of different ways because the whole point was to find a practical way to be able to film for a long period of time, ordinary people. And because of the social constraints, you can't really film inside people's houses so much if you wanted to film a family, which might have been ideal, but because of the social norms, it's impossible to do that, or very difficult. And so, filming in a school is just a way to give you access to a large number of people who could become main characters in your movie. And then you sort of have to cast them. Much like fiction, you're looking for people who can be filmed, who are natural in front of a camera, who will be interesting to an audience, who have something to say, people who can talk in front of a microphone. Not everyone can do it, not everyone wants to do it. So again, it's just kind of finding a way in. You know, a lot of people talk about storytelling, and it's become very fashionable to say that we're all storytellers. But I think, I mean, just because I'm a contrarian, I'm just going to throw out there that I'm really against storytelling per se. I think storytelling is nice for kids, but at a certain point, as adult filmgoers, I think we should be interested also in other things besides merely being led through some entertaining series of sort of contrived events, or a contrived series of real events. I'm really interested in creating something different, which is more like being inside the head of somebody else, an experiential type of film, a more sensory type of film. And I don't know whether I achieved it in this movie, but that's what I'm going for. I really want to take the audience and put them inside somebody else. And so you can hear their thoughts and see what they're seeing, and understand their environments and their personality. And those are the things that are motivating to me. It's not a story, because a story, you'll come out of the film, you'll remember the story, but the story, I mean, stories are just made up. And I'm trying to make a film about Afghanistan, really, and what it's really like. To convey something to the audience, where after they give me their 2 hours, and then my deal with them is that I give them a real experience of Afghanistan, a memory of Afghanistan. It's not a story per se, but it's the memory of the place and the people, which I hope is going to stick with them, and also be realistic, be something that actually conveys a real sense of the place. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Well, I mean, that's terrific, and I hope that when you see the film, I feel like that explanation is so interesting to me, because you do get that from the film. There is a sort of inner life of the people that you're seeing that I found transformative.
Tomorrow, 3 p.m.
But that's a very valid and very interesting way of thinking about it, and that rings true, I think, for the style of your film and what you've achieved in that. And Manny, I was wondering about that connection to your film, because your film is about a place. It's not really about, although people, of course, are observed. I felt it was sort of the inner life of the city that I was thinking about when I watched the film.
Yes. However, I think there's storytelling and storytelling. So that, I think the kind of storytelling that you're talking about is like narrative films that come out of Hollywood, or that are so-called story films. But in my film, I think I got a story going, for a while anyway. In which a building is being built. And I keep coming back to that story, even though I diverge, even though I go to nature, I go to dance of cranes, and so on. And even at the very end, there's a shovel, a big shovel, so that I don't lose sight of what's happening. And my travels in the sky are along box-like buildings, so that there is a different kind of a story being told. And documentary can inhabit stories like that, right? That they don't have to be explicit, but they do need follow-through. You can't just begin with a construction site, as my film does, and then leave it at that. You've got to go on with that. Otherwise, now, there can also be non-story films. For example, the next film that was shown, a film about Carmine Street, that didn't have a story. But it was lovely, I thought, particularly because unlike documentaries of that kind, it didn't have B-roll. It had one illustration where he talks about finding tools, and it shows this disarray and stuff all over the place. But he says, if you know where you put them, then it's easy to find. And that was the one illustrative image in the film. The other B-roll material was the front of the shop and him bicycling, which were nice interludes to have between music. So what I'm saying is that in documentary, you can have that kind of a film. You can have a film with a pseudo story in it, and you can have many other kinds of forms.
So nonfiction and documentary really allows for different filmmakers to explore what's important to them stylistically and with their content, of course, as well.
Yes, I would say that.
Alexis, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, I'm thinking about you because I'm thinking about this sort of boom that's happening now in the documentary world, or the supposed boom of commercially successful films. And I'm looking at your film as a film that's about a very prominent person in our culture. And I'm just wondering what challenges you face or don't face in trying to tell a story, or not tell a story, if you don't, depending on how you look at it, of a person, a personality like that. And in our culture, have you seen that kind of change in that ability to tell these stories of that kind?
I mean, it's, there are just so many different kinds of stories. Would I have, I had a sort of goal. I wanted to capture the life and times of Roger Ailes and kind of, draw him into our world and kind of have this carnival house mirrors that he is us and we are him, and kind of not so much tell a story as kind of a parable, but I did have a sense of what
It's okay to have a story.
No, I know. But I was going to say, it's, there's an essential kind of visceral, emotional arc, like with this follow through, something, it has to be meaningful in some way. Would I have liked to have, filmed Roger Ailes when he woke up in the morning and kind of put his pants on? Absolutely, because, this colossally arthritic man, getting up in the morning and just physically the act of getting dressed, that kind of immersive access would have said so much about his desperation, and I think about his cruelty, because he was hobbled by, haemophilia. As one of the characters in our film says, the opposite of death is desire, and he desired mightily. But I didn't have that kind of access. He died when we were making the film, and then, B, his family provided us with no archive, and we couldn't get access to that sort of intimacy. So you make, necessity is the mother of invention. You make a different kind of film, and one that I hope is, entertaining and informative. And as you said, this sort of commercial aspect, I wasn't given, it wasn't, I'm trying to choose my words so they don't come back and bite me in the bum. Films have different commissioning structures. So you can make a film like Iraq in Fragments and people trust you to make another kind of immersive film or whatever, and you cobble together your funding whatever way you do, or you get, for instance, in my instance, quite a strict timetable. You've got a year to shoot, deliver it, get it out, and that dictates, sometimes a certain form. And God, am I answering your question? I don't know whether it's commercial, my film. I tried to make it entertaining. So many people said, I don't want to spend, an hour or 2 hours in the company of this man. And I thought it was so friggin' important that they did, that I tried to make it, as entertaining and gripping as possible. Because I think that his, the scaffolding of his life needs to be understood, because it's the scaffolding we're all sort of climbing on. But yeah, I don't know whether it'll be commercially successful. We shall see. It's coming out in cinemas December 7th.
Everyone gets to plug once. So you each get one chance at it. So, your film, Mark, is it's really taken the essence of the whole film. There are no other interviews except for Bill. And you have built this very rich story of him through his photographs, but also archival footage. And how did you end up being able to, well, where's the launching pad for it, you know?
Yeah, I think that in this whole discussion about documentaries and look at this summer, all the documentaries and Mr. Rogers, in many ways I think Bill Cunningham was sort of like the Mr. Rogers of society and fashion and what have you, because he really believed in it. He didn't fake it, he believed in it. But as I was doing the research for my film, and you do what all these guys do, and you call everybody and you search online and you do all that, I found an interview that he did in 2012 with Fern Malice at the 92nd Street Y, and he was quite old then and quite deaf. But here was this incredible guy schooling everyone there, saying that, look at technology, technology's changing everything. You have to design with the inside of your brain and not the outside of your brain. And then he says, look at the lines of that Apple store on 59th Street and 5th Avenue. Do you see lines coming out of Saks Fifth Avenue and Bergdorf Goodman? And he was right, and when I saw that in the midst of like a year into the process, I thought, well, I just don't want to make a movie that, as great as it's going to be, I hope on Thursday at 6 o'clock at Ellis Tully Hall, that's my plug, thank you, that just has a film festival, and then it sells to whomever, and then it kind of goes into the whole, system of documentaries. I wanted to do something that could take this incredible character. It wasn't just a great photographer. He doesn't have a great image. He doesn't have like a Herb Ritts picture or an Annie Leibovitz. But his body of work and his humility, that was really great. And so when I heard that thing about Apple, I reached out to the woman who runs Apple Retail last summer, named Angela Ahrens, who used to be the CEO of Burberry. I figured she was a Bill fan. I said, hey, you're trying to change Apple stores into these experiential places. And so I took a little trailer of the film, and I had just gotten Sarah Jessica Parker to say yes to narrate the film, like 3 days before, and I embedded the trailer, this rough trailer, as if it were playing in these Apple stores all over the world, in Tokyo and Singapore, and they have these massive big 6K screens, and I sent it to her, cold. I got the email from somebody else. And she called me 2 days later and said, this is amazing, and now we're gonna show you what we're gonna help you to do. And the film was halfway done. So last fall, I went on this world tour to New York and San Francisco and London and Paris and Singapore and Japan, where we were able to show a 2-minute trailer of the film and have all these different influencers at these different places, that people that really knew Bill, and David Montgomery in London, who was this great British photographer who gave Bill his first camera in 1967, and he talks about it in the film incredibly passionately. He remembers exactly that feeling, and I have those pictures that he took, the back of the negative, when he wrote all those things. But you could see then, and for me, I've always, because of what I used to do in my sort of commerce world, that you could take a documentary and you could, here we were in these, the Apple Regent store, the Apple Singapore store, and these amazing stores surrounded by 400 people learning about this guy, Bill Cunningham, and then everybody went on the street for an hour with their iPhones, of course, and they were Bill Cunningham for an hour, and then Apple airdropped these pictures back into the screen, and people could come back into the store from being out on the street and experience that. And so, for me, the whole relevancy, we were talking a little bit earlier about documentaries and how it's the boom, right? And we, over years of documentaries being made, at the back of Blockbuster you could find your film, and now there's so much of that, but I believe very strongly that there's much more. It's not even documentaries anymore, it's called content. That you could develop content and create these experiences where you can touch somebody, no matter what the topic is, in a much more relevant kind of way. And I think we're in this tipping point now of all of these kinds of film that you can reach an audience in a much more impactful way than we used to in the past.
Well, I think documentary filmmakers have to be flexible in terms of where they can find their funding, and it certainly is true that people who have started to invest, quote unquote, invest in documentaries has been something that's been going on for a number of years, and now, of course, we're seeing more and more broadcasters are investing more and more money, but we still need our ITVS and our public TV access to make sure that some of the films that are not perhaps for a Netflix or for a network that is more commercial still get made, because those films need to have an audience as well. I will hope, if it's okay, we're going to turn it over to the audience because we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand, and then we have a microphone that's going to come to you over there. Right, someone's going to bring a mic there.
Sorry, I was late, but the last one goes first, so thank you so much. Alexis, I saw the movie the other night, and I really enjoyed it. And I was wondering, how did you get the money for it?
I get the money. You shop it around. I mean, you take an idea and and or footage to different people and get them interested. And there are many people who we spoke to or showed footage to who were not interested, or who were interested. Sorry, I'm not answering your question.
No, who was the main?
Who was the main funder? A&E Indie Films was the main funder. So they came in first, and then a number, like a whole, there was Baird Films came in, and Impact came in. Magnolia Pictures bought it.
Okay, can all the filmmakers speak to that question?
Sure.
How do we raise the money? It's no different than anyone else. You hope and you pray and you put together little 15,000 different sizzle reels, and you send it to this person, and you send it to that person, and it's a process. It's definitely raising money from that in terms of certainly in my previous life was a challenge. But we all have this passion to want to get it made, and it's painful, and you spend every cent that you have. And then, in my case, I was lucky enough to have, some angels in my family or in my neighborhood, and someone named Susan Rockefeller, who is a huge FOB fan of Bill, they were big. Her and her husband and their whole family. I mean, he photographed their entire family since like the mid '60s, and so she was, for me, anyways. That was the impetus for getting other people involved to help fund the film.
Any of you gentlemen want to share your?
Me?
Yes, sir.
Oh, let's see. I newly have an agent. Never had anything like that.
Just in time.
And when I told him what I was doing, he said, I want in. So there was about $10,000 involved, and he paid for it. The old footage, my friend Walter and I, we split the bill. We didn't look for outside funding. And on this new project, Jake was the only one who financed it. And it came in at about $10,000. The digitization, the mix, the flecking of it. So it was a simple matter. Usually, however, when I have a new shoot, I get old students to do the shooting and to act as crew. And I wasn't able to pay them until this year when I came into a little bit of money on one of my films. On two of my films, which went to the Sundance Channel and brought me some money, so I was able to give it to them. But I've never had, I got into making independent documentary films because I was working in the industry, and I was disgusted with my role in it. I was an editor, but the producers would always step in and change the film. And even though the projects were interesting. I didn't look for funding for the longest time. I always put my own savings into it. And I did that on my newest film, which isn't finished yet, but is almost finished, called Middle Class Money, Honey, which is about money in the lives of middle class people. And for that, I actually paid my crew, but out of my own funds.
James? Paul?
I had this idea when I started making documentaries that I was going to do it really independently, and I would just put in my own money because I shoot the things myself, and I just train local people to record sound, and it's not expensive what I'm doing, and I try to do everything as much as I can on my own. And I thought that I will make films, and those films will then pay for the next film. I had this kind of idealistic idea, and it actually worked for the first two features. But somewhere in the middle of Iran, the money that I had made from my Iraq film ran out after I was kicked out of Iran, so I didn't know what to do. And then, out of nowhere, I received a Macarthur Fellowship, so that was lucky. And the Macarthur Fellowship goes for 5 years, and you get a large amount of money every year, every quarter, inserted into your bank account, and there's no strings attached. It's just your money. You can buy a house with it or do whatever you want. And of course, because I'm addicted to filmmaking, I spent every dime of it making this Afghanistan film. Well, first in Pakistan, of course. And the beautiful thing about the Macarthur Fellowship was that it allowed me to go to Pakistan for 2 years, fail to make a film there, and then move my project to Afghanistan and continue to work. And I never had to ask anybody's permission, and I never had to apply for a single grant until I was done shooting the material. So then I had 500 hours of material filmed in Afghanistan, and it was much easier to get funding for post-production because everything is in the can. The downside of, the brilliant side of that is that it's your movie, and you can do what you want with it. And the downside of it is that you'll never get paid. I won't make a dime off of this movie. So in the future, I expect I'll have to do what everybody else does, which is just from the very beginning, pitch an idea and get funding for it. So my dreams of real independence are over, but maybe they'll come back.
Tom?
Kickstarter.
Is that right? Is your whole film funded by Kickstarter?
Until about 3 weeks ago, pretty much, yeah.
That's fantastic.
I think that the idea of Kickstarter and all of these different ways of doing it, the whole notion of a documentary doesn't have to be just like Shakespeare in the Park, which is a lovely sort of thing, but it doesn't pay the rent. But if you could create this sort of way with Kickstarters, you can create this is a completely off the topic thing, but I think it's super relevant. If you go to Scape in New York, which to me is like the greatest place in New York City right now, that's this 30,000 square foot place for insane, where you can be a KGB agent, you can be MI5, but they have these AI and AR and VR and all this incredible stuff. And I was in there a couple weeks ago, I thought, wow, if documentaries could figure out how to create that same kind of experience. It's not like you want to be in the classroom in Afghanistan necessarily, but you could have that experiential, this new word that was created a year ago, that thing that could propel these films and these discussions into something way more relative than the sort of traditional way that we see them.
I'm going to plug something now, because we have Convergence, which is next weekend, which is our experiential section, and it does include some nonfiction in it, and I think that is actually a really interesting point. When I was at Sundance this year, I saw basically a space documentary that was VR, all encompassing, and it was a documentary about going to space, but you were in space, and it was a very, very hard to explain experience, but it felt like that you're exactly right, that's sort of where things are going in that storytelling thing, James, that dirty word of storytelling.
Well, yeah.
You can't walk that back.
So about VR though, don't you think that when it comes, I mean, okay, computer constructed virtual reality is one thing, but don't you think that filming the real world, they're kind of doing it wrong at this point, where all the cameras, all these VR cameras are 360 degrees, and you kind of, I've used one, and you have to, with all the 16 GoPros or whatever, and you have to put it out on a tripod and then run away and hide from it. If you don't want to be in the shot, you've got to be operating the thing by remote control, and you can't even see what's around it. And if people are too close to it, their legs start disappearing. If they're too far away, they're just like ants in the distance. I mean, they've got to make something which is like actually approximating human vision. And it's unfathomable to me why they keep on making these 360-degree cameras that no one can use except as these static shots.
Well, I definitely think that there's a range of ways that people are using it for sure, and that's very common.
Right,
And then what I've seen now is taking raw footage shot not for VR and using it in that way. And this is like NASA footage that's not shot 360, but using it in a different kind of platform. But I think it's sort of what you want to do with it, isn't it? I mean, that's sort of the interesting part of it.
I think we're still waiting for that to arrive.
Yeah.
I think the engineers are holding us back.
But it has to happen. It has to happen. I think that this moment of time where technology is evolving, it's still nascent as it relates to certainly these kinds of topics, but that kind of experiential thing has to happen, because it's like stores can't continue the way they're doing right now. Magazines cannot continue the way they're doing it. Documentary films cannot continue exactly along these traditional paths, that there has to be breakthroughs to reach bigger audiences, to fund these films that we're so passionate about. And that's why I think we all get a little bit older, but it's like people who are on Instagram, it's ridiculous not to be on that. If you want to have any sort of connection to the world and reach an audience that's not just people over 50. That's an audience that are millennials and are on their phone. How do you tap them? How do you get them to watch your documentary? And how do you get them to reach in those kinds of ways? And it's certainly not easy, but I applaud the process of this confusion of these 360 cameras and all that, because if it's just a red camera or my phone or whatever, it's okay, but it has to move into some direction. Otherwise, if you deny it, you end up being not as relevant, in my opinion.
Yes, sir. But just get a mic down here. Thank you.
Well, I think we've kind of danced around this a lot throughout this conversation, but documentary is changing to where if you have somebody like a Fred Rogers or RBG, it's commercially successful just because of the name of the topic or the person, subject matter. So when you're going and thinking about doing a film that's niche to a part of jazz, how do you think about, or how do you go about saying, I'm going to make this film opposed to maybe one about Herbie Hancock where I know it's going to be commercially successful? So you have something that you're obviously very passionate about, but we all still need to make a living, and we're getting to the point where we know like a Netflix might pick up something specifically opposed to something we're really passionate about.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if a doc about Herbie Hancock would be that would
Sure,
be,
but I guess.
I think jazz is a four-letter word for most of contemporary culture, but so you're asking me why did I focus on?
It was to the whole panel, really, just the
I'll
difference
speak
between
for
passion and something that could.
Well, because isn't it true that as doc filmmakers, you're always having that balance, right, of those projects that are, of course, you want to be passionate about all your projects, but you have to make a living and, all of that. How do you strike that balance?
It's a difference about, living off your income as a documentary filmmaker and documentary filmmaking as a hobby. And if you look at a lot of filmmakers, they're independently wealthy. It's true. There are loads of them. Not all of them, but lots of them.
I mean, I think it's hard to, even in narrative film, it's hard to anticipate what is going to be profitable.
No, but if you throw a celebrity or a death or, I mean, it's just, it's just true. Like if if you really need to earn money, if somebody's like, this is what I do, and I'm desperate because my kid's in school and my rent is due and I need to make a film and I need to sell it now, I would say, you know, pick a celebrity. Have you got access to a celebrity? Have you got access to, you know, some sensational, sexy subject? And that's what you're going to have to do for the next year. If it doesn't matter to you if you have a day job, or if you shoot at the same time, or if you're an editor, or you teach, all of those things are great careers to have that enable you to make great documentaries while doing something else. And that's the beauty of filmmaking, is that you can, you know, teach and make a film at the same time. You don't have to do it every day. But, you know, I know that I made a film about Carrie Fisher and Debbie Reynolds, and believe me, you know, prior to their death, people were not that interested in it. And when they died, all of a sudden it was like, wow, this thing's really, you know, everyone wants to see it. And there was some, you know, they didn't change, you know, well, they did change, but...
But that is the sort of dirty little secret of the documentary world that's talked, I think, more in documentary conferences among documentary filmmakers. It was a big part of the big IDA documentary conference last week in California, and it's about sustainability. How do you sustain your career? And it's a very, very valid and an important question to bring up. So thank you for bringing that up.
You don't have to. What's being forgotten here is you don't have to make films to make a living. You can make a living in other ways, because we all have other skills. And then reserve the, you know, every 5 years or so, the time to make a film. So it doesn't have to, you don't have to be dependent on films to make a living.
Would it be nice?
Yeah, it would be, I don't know, but I certainly didn't start my film going, well, I'm just going to be a passion project and be a nice credit on IMDb, and that's all sort of lovely. You know, I definitely didn't. I mean, the art, the idea of art and commerce, and how do you make art that can be commercial? You know, from my perspective, you check off certain boxes, right? You have a good guy named Bill Cunningham. He's passed away. There's a huge amount of following, and there's all this sort of great feeling about him, etc. But you check off certain boxes. You get a narrator called Sarah Jessica Parker, who's sort of the voice of New York, and that helps your film become a little bit more commercial. You get Moby to agree to give you amazing amount of music for a little bit of money, and you hire a 26-year-old African-American violinist named Azinma, who's on fire, who creates this amazing score. It's not because you're selling out because you have a celebrity. You want to make something that will be seen by as many people as possible, that you can possibly sort of do. And if you can make money in the process, then that's great. That's just me, right? This is my first one, but I certainly haven't approached it knowing that it was not going to make any money, because I have to make money. And that drives me in a huge way.
Yeah, but you don't have to make it through film.
But why not? But why not?
Well, because you're selling out. If you
See, art and commerce. I understand. And I accept that
you talk about looking
dig
at
perfectly well.
You talk about looking at the commercial possibilities, but it seems to me that an independent filmmaker should make the film that he or she wants to make, and that should be the rules.
Right, for certain people. I have a 10-year-old son who goes to school, and I want to make sure that he goes to a good school, and I have a house. That shouldn't, it shouldn't be the only reason why you should just be so ruthlessly independent and your art is going to drive everything. I don't buy it. I just don't. I think there's so many different methods that you certainly have had your method. You've had an amazing career, but I think the idea that you can't make, you should do what you want to do and then figure out your day job at Best Buy, that should fund your film. I don't subscribe to that, but that's the beauty of, you know, differences of opinion about how these movies get made.
Fair enough. Yeah.
I have a question about editing. When you're interviewing many people, when you have a lot of footage of just hours of interviews and they're all visually very similar, how do you edit the story together in a way that's still entertaining and artistic? And how do you find a narrative in something that doesn't inherently have a narrative?
A lot of takers for that one.
I mean, I told a very specific story, I guess. I had a preconceived notion of my starting point and my end point. I just sort of, I worked with an editor, we had chapter heads, which are actually made it to the final cut, so, you know, I would say.
Tom, just hold on 1 second. Your mic, we're not hearing your mic.
Oh, that's okay.
All right, speak a little louder, though. Okay.
How's that?
Yes.
I have to
Okay.
throw this one. And now I'm feeding back. All right. Let's just move on. No. I mean, it's a it's a daunting task. You know, I had like many hundreds of hours of footage and 33 interviews, a lot of information to synthesize. But what I was saying is I had we had chapter heads, which made it to the eventual cut. So we'd have a starting point, and we'd have, you know, I mean, I think my first chapter is how to bop or not to bop, and then we went from there to out of the bop and into the fire. So we had to figure out all the connecting tissues, and my editor and I had long conversations, and you know, I don't know, did I illuminate you at all, or I don't know what else to say. So basically, we really had a beginning and an end. We had to figure out the middle. That's the best way I can.
Alexis, you went through a lot of...
Can I just add, Jean-Luc Godard famously professed that every movie has a beginning, middle, and end, just not necessarily in that order. So.
I mean, the opportunities are kind of endless, and you have to think about what story you're telling, I think. You know, you're saying basically, what do you do when you have a whole bunch of talking heads and nothing else? Well, what story are you trying to tell? You know, if it's a story about music, use music. You know, use, scenes of people performing the kinds of things that your talking heads are talking about. Go back and find archive. You know, shoot recreations, impressionistic, if not, like if you're talking about, you have talking heads, you have two people talking about a marriage that's broken up, you can just do everything with like light and shadow, or you just have to close your eyes, think about what is the story you're telling and how do you visualize it. And there are so many different things you can draw upon, both visually, but in terms of audio as well, and going from very literal to completely out there and atmospheric, And I'd say watch films, just watch, and the films that you love, take notes and say, how did they do that, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I want to thank our panel so much for their time.